welcome to the Archaeological Society of Delaware's Digging Delaware series. Here, I'll be speaking with Delaware archaeologists about their experiences and how they got into archaeology. Today, I'm speaking with Delaware archaeologist Kyle Edwards, who works for the Delaware Department of Transportation. So welcome, Kyle. Why don't you give us a little background on who you are?
Hi, Curtis. Thanks for having me. As you already said, I'm an archaeologist for the Delaware Department of Transportation. Lots of people don't realize that Department of Transportation all across the country have archaeologists, and we handle sort of assessing impacts to archaeological resources associated with highway construction and maintenance projects. So we work all over Delaware and on all types of sites and scales of projects. So a little background about me. I'm a historical archaeologist by training, and I started my training as an archaeologist at the College of William and Mary, where I studied history and anthropology. I then went to University of Massachusetts, Boston, where I studied historical archaeology and finished my master's degree. And I'm currently still enrolled at the University of Virginia, completing my PhD in anthropology, and working on my dissertation on a plantation site in Central Virginia.
Well, Kyle, what made you actually want to become an archaeologist?
Well, that's sort of an interesting story, or maybe not so interesting, just interesting to me, maybe. I feel like archaeology is one of those fields where there are those of us who sort of fall into it or back into it, and then those of us who, from the moment they're aware of what archaeology is, they want to become one. I am actually of the former category. So I was an undergraduate student. I had gone through several different majors, and at the time I was actually a history major, focusing in sort of cultural and social history in Europe. In one semester, I was enrolled in a history of music class, and I think I purchased the book and realized that it was boring. So I needed something else in the time slot. And I actually enrolled in an archaeology class, a historical archaeology class with a graduate student at William and Mary. Her name is Catherine Sykes, and she still teaches archaeology as an active archaeologist. I doubt she'll watch this, but I'll just give her a little shout out. And she was teaching a course called Dirty Histories. That was actually a sort of intro to historical archaeology. And over fall break, we did a small field project. And I enrolled in the class to fill out my schedule. And I actually had to have a meeting with her because I didn't have any of the prerequisites. And she decided to let me take it. And I really fell in love with the discipline. What I found out was actually the things about people that made me interested in history and that I wanted to know about history were better answered through archaeology and anthropology than they were through some of the methods of history that I had been learning in my other courses. So I really saw that I could learn about people who weren't in the documents and learn about the things that affected everyday life better through archaeology than I could in my current major at the time. So that really started my passion for archaeology, and I filled up my schedule with it, and the rest is sort of history. Sort of since that time, 12 years ago, I've more or less been doing archaeology all the time, and that's sort of all I've been thinking about professionally and academically.
Well, with that, in a minute or less, what's some of your current research interests?
So currently, I always have my hand in some Delaware related things because we always have projects going on throughout the state. So as it relates to Delaware, and this has been somewhat working with you, Curtis, and Bill, who's been on the series before, sort of land tenancy and agriculture in Southern Delaware, and sort of learning more about that and developing a better understanding on how agriculture and rural communities are really unique in Delaware when compared to elsewhere in the Mid-Atlantic. And this sort of compares to my own research interest before coming to DelDOT. So this gets more into my current research. As I said before, I'm currently completing my dissertation, which is at a plantation in Central Virginia called Highland. That was the home of James Monroe he owned it from 1793 to, I think, 1826 off the top of my head. And my dissertation and my research there is actually looking at the plantation landscape and how people in Central Virginia use the landscape of these plantations to sort of make sense of their lives and derive meaning from them. And not only that, but how that meaning changed and was adapted over the course of the 19th century in relation to sort of both agricultural reforms and broad social changes, particularly those related to the antebellum, where sort of Virginia's relationships with enslavement and enslaved labor changed. This really did have to do with agriculture and agricultural strategies. And then later on, after the Civil War, how the plantations were recontextualized and reconfigured to sort of develop an idealized view of the past. So really, I think, or broadly rather, apart from this one site, I'm sort of interested in how people derive meaning from space and objects and how that changes through time and how we sort of continue to derive meaning from them, even if the context of our lives change.
So Kyle, what's one of your best or worst field stories?
So when you told me about this question, Curtis, I actually had to think of it for a little while, whether it would be tick-borne illness related or high temperatures or, horror stories, biting ants in the Southwest. And I think my really worst experience happened while doing my dissertation field work. I spent a lot of time out in the field by myself, digging shovel tests for long hours in the summer. And I had a composite shovel handle, and I left it out in the sun too long and actually ended up getting very mild burns all over my hands, and then, had to continue digging my hole. So my worst field experience, I'd have to say, was that. And I think it was one of those times too, where you have undergraduates and other people coming over and talking with you and trying to work with you, and you don't really want to admit to your own folly in those situations.
Well, what's one of the coolest things you've learned from an archaeological project?
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard question. I've worked on sites all over New England, Mid-Atlantic, the Southwest. And I think at all of them, you learn something sort of interesting, even if it's just about yourself, or typically what I learned from most sites is how not to do something again. So you go out in the field and you start excavating and you think this is a great idea, whatever way you're engaged in, and then realize never again. But the coolest actual anthropological / archaeological thing I learned is probably related to my master's thesis. So for that project, I worked on a 17th century site in central New Mexico, and it's actually one of the few sort of Spanish domestic sites documented from prior to the Pueblo Revolt. And I was doing some of the environmental archaeology for that site, specifically the pollen studies. So for this project, we took a pollen core, and my goal was to sort of understand how the implementation of Spanish agricultural practices impacted the local environment and sort of the anthropogenic landscape that existed prior to colonization. And I think, both I and my advisor and the other people working on the project had this expectation that it was going to be like everywhere else, where we'd go and we'd get the data and we'd see this sort of spike of weedy plants, or the invasives would show up and be, aha, here are the Spanish, and we can see how they really decimated this environment or reconfigured the landscape for their own sort of conceptions of how agriculture should work or something like that. But actually what we saw is not a whole lot happened at first. And it wasn't until much later, when later in the 18th and 19th century, when there was more livestock in the area and population of European settlers grew, that we saw really significant impacts in the local plant communities. And I think this was really not profound, but interesting to me, because we always talk about sort of the ability of, not the ability, rather, we talk about we shouldn't always focus on discontinuity between pre-contact and post-contact world. But that's at some level what we're always looking for. And this was a clear example, was where we had that sort of continuity of environment and landscape that said something interesting about how the colonial process occurred. And I think the other part of it is it sort of taught me that old adage that zeros are data too. Like we always want to see something or see something different or document the change. But sometimes not seeing that can be equally as important and help us come to an important discovery or have a nuanced discussion about what culturally, socially, environmentally is going on.
Yeah. I mean, negative data is still data, and then you can
Yeah.
still learn a lot from that.
Yeah.
So, Kyle, how are you surviving quarantine right now?
Well, Curtis, it's been challenging. I have an almost 2-year-old who has a lot of energy and he likes to play, which is both good. So sort of being in self-isolation at home, I get a little more playtime than I normally would going to the office every day. But at the same time, it can be noisy. So we've been surviving by taking lots of bike rides, walks, and jogs, getting outside, getting fresh air, expending some energy. And then in those quiet times when he's actually asleep and I'm still awake, which aren't as frequent as I'd like them to be, reading a lot of historical fiction. So getting away from the no offense, the tedium of archaeological reports or research related stuff and reading a little for pleasure again.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm doing the exact same thing. So,
Yeah.
well, Kyle, thank you for joining us today. It was a pleasure talking to you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Curtis. And thank you to all the members of the ASD. I hope everyone's doing well at home.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.